Before we begin, I'd love to know, what time is it where you are right now? And where in the world are you listening from tonight? Let me know in the comments below, and if this quiet little journey through history helps you drift off, please consider subscribing. It really means a lot. Now close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let's step backward, through mud, through fog, through the aching silence of old thatched villages, because tonight we're going to a place where the fields are always damp, the fire is always low, and being pregnant isn't a miracle. It's a trial. The year is sometime in the early 1300s. The church bell rings in the far-off manor village, its sound swallowed by the morning mist. Chickens flutter through puddles outside. A wooden wheel creaks. Smoke rises from one chimney, not because someone is cooking, but because someone is trying to boil lye-soaked laundry. You are a woman in your second trimester. Your feet ache. Your belly is beginning to swell, but you keep it hidden under layers of worn wool. Not because you're shy, but because warmth is survival and clothes are precious, and because no one, not even your mother, ever described pregnancy as anything other than a cross to carry. There is no glow. There is no pampering. You've already worked through the morning, fed the hens, pulled a bucket from the well, stoked the fire, carried kindling that scraped your side. Now you sit beside a chipped wooden table, slowly sewing a tiny shift for the child you carry. Not because it's tradition, but because it's expected. Babies are wrapped as soon as they're born. Not for modesty, but to keep their legs straight, to keep their bodies warm, to keep death at bay. No one has asked you if you're excited, because in your village excitement is something reserved for harvest feasts and gossip about runaway pigs. Not for childbirth. Your back hurts, not in some quaint, idle way, but with a deep pulsing stiffness that has climbed from your hips to your ribs. You don't mention it aloud, because your neighbor who lost her last child in the frost of winter would give anything to have that ache again, because the midwife who delivered her, and 3 of yours, would slap your arm and say, "At least your legs still move, girl," because the priest would tell you pain is a woman's inheritance, and so you sit and you sew, and your body continues its work in silence. You want bread, not much, just a crust, something warm. But the oven hasn't been fired since the miller's wife miscarried last week, and the women are still mourning her with silence and broth. You chew on yesterday's barley cake instead. It's hard, gritty, tastes faintly of soot. Still, you don't complain, because the baby is hungry too. And there's nothing more to give it. There is no doctor. The closest thing is old Magda, who lives in the thatched hut at the edge of the village. She's not truly a healer, just a widow with a strong stomach and a sharp tongue. She knows the herbs, the teas, the tinctures that make your belly stop cramping or start. But she's also feared, whispered about, because her mother was hanged in the last famine, accused of bewitching the barley fields when the crop failed. So you visit her at dusk, quietly, hood up, and ask for dried raspberry leaves. She gives you a pouch, doesn't charge you, just looks into your eyes for a long, long moment and says, "This is not the hardest part." You nod. You already know. At night, you do not sleep. Not well. Not when the child kicks your ribs. Not when the wind howls through the cracked shutters. Not when your husband turns in his sleep, unaware of your tears. He loves you in his way. But he is tired. He works the land. He prays. He does not ask how you feel, because he does not know how to answer if you say anything other than fine. So you stay quiet. You place a hand on your stomach and wonder, not if your child will be a boy or a girl, but if it will live. Death is always close here. It hides in the rainwater under the floorboards. It perches in the cough of your neighbor's child. It settles into the joints of the old, the young, the unborn. You have buried one already, a baby born too soon, too small. He never opened his eyes. You did not scream when you bled. You did not curse, you simply lit a candle, wrapped him in your only linen and dug the dirt with your own hands. The women of the village know. They do not speak of it often. But in the way they pass you bread, or brush your hair, or straighten your shift before church, you feel it. The long invisible thread that binds the wombs of women across the centuries. They have all bled, all feared, all lost, all hoped. And now they hope for you not loudly, but in the way they leave broth at your door, or place lavender under your pillow when you're not looking. Morning again, you rise with the sun. You're more tired than the night before. Your hips ache, your wrists swell, but you stand, you pull on your stockings, you lace your boots, you wrap your shawl, and you begin again. Because in a medieval village, to be pregnant is to be neither sick nor sacred. It is to be in between. It is to be alive for now, and that for today is enough. The wind had changed overnight. A low rumbling gust had crept in from the northern fens and rolled through the wooden cottages like a quiet warning. Roofs creaked, chimneys whistled, and thin slats of cold slipped beneath the rush-covered floors. Morning arrived not with song or sun, but with grey. Grey skies, grey soil, grey breath hanging in the mouths of tired villagers trudging toward the fields. In the smallest cottage near the well, a woman stood with one hand resting against the stone doorway, her other arm wrapped protectively over her growing belly. Her name was Elswith, and though her name meant elf strength in a language older than the manor lord's deeds, there was no strength in her this morning. She was 6 months along. Elswith was not the first to carry in this village, and she would not be the last. But her journey had become particularly difficult, not because of any rare condition or curse or mistake, but because the body was doing what it was made to do, slowly, clumsily, and in pain. The midwife had told her last week, while grinding valerian with a stone pestle, that the child's position was wrong, low, tugging too early. A sign that the body would fight at the end or perhaps give in too soon. There was nothing to be done. No ointment, no poultice, no prayer that hadn't already been whispered in dark corners of cold churches. So Elswith waited. She hauled buckets and stirred stews and sat in silence. Sometimes she pressed her hand to the sharp ridges of her belly and tried to guess what lay within. Sometimes she imagined it was a girl. Soft curls, wide eyes, a future wrapped in wool and hope. But most times she dared not imagine at all. In the field beyond the pastures, another woman knelt beside a small herb garden, plucking dried fennel, stems from cracked soil. Her fingers were stiff from cold and her wrists swollen from years of birth and loss. Her name was Gilda. She had birthed 5. 3 had died. 1 from cough. 1 from a fever that took the entire West Hamlet. And the last, a girl born silent, swaddled in the still heat of mid-June, then buried under a crooked elm 3 days later. Gilda knew the signs. She could spot the limp walk, the quiet breath, the shift in a woman's gaze as the months wore on and the weight grew heavier, not just in body, but in soul. When she saw Elswith that morning, she said nothing. She simply handed her the fennel, nodded once, and returned to her picking. Words were wasted in such seasons. At the edge of the village, down by the pigsty, a child cried out in pain. He had tripped on a stone and scraped his knee, and his mother, a young woman named Wenna, pregnant with her second, bent slowly to help him. The movement cost her. Her breath caught. A sharp cramp curled beneath her ribs. She bit down, hard on her lip, and forced herself upright. There were no midwives near, no clean linens. No one to carry the child home but herself. And so she lifted him, heavy, wailing, his muddy boots staining her apron. She did not scold. She did not sigh. She simply walked. Because in this village, pregnancy was not a reprieve. It was an added, wait, one more task to carry between sun and snow. The midwife, named Tilda, was near 50. Her back was bowed and her hands always smelled faintly of ash and dried herbs. She had seen so many births that she no longer cried at the outcomes, only at the silences. Tilda was summoned that afternoon when another woman, Marta, began bleeding early. Her pale trail across straw bedding, a sob that had no strength. Marta's 4th pregnancy, her first in 5 years. There was no water left, the firewood had not yet arrived, and the pig had broken loose and eaten half the preserved bread. Still, Tilda came, with a basin, a cloth, and her own tired knees, no medicines, just presence. Sometimes that was enough, but that evening it was not. The village priest passed by Tilda's hut as the sun dipped low. He offered a blessing, though she did not ask for one. He quoted scripture about Eve's sorrow and the wages of sin. Tilda did not answer. She simply stared out across the frozen soil and thought of the women, too many now to remember clearly, who had looked to the sky during labor and said, "Please, not please save me, not please end this, just please." And the sky had remained, as always, terribly quiet. Elswyth slept uneasily that night. The child inside her shifted again, wrongly, painfully. She wrapped herself in furs and tried not to move. Her husband, worn from hauling peat and bartering, for grain, murmured something in his sleep and turned away. The fire had gone out hours before. The cold bit at her toes, and in the stillness she thought of the women before her, of her mother, who bled out by the hearth, of her cousin, who lost 2 within a year, of the bones buried behind the chapel, nameless and wrapped in decay. It was not fear she felt, not exactly, but something older than fear, a kind of numb resignation that crept up from the spine and sat heavily behind the eyes. The rooster crowed before dawn. A bucket overturned in the frost. The first sound of the day was not prayer, not joy, not peace, but coughing. Deep hacking from a boy with a wet chest and a fading glow in his cheeks. Elswyth stood slowly, one hand on her side, the other reaching for her shawl. And as she stepped onto the stone threshold, she paused. She did not smile. She did not cry. She simply walked forward into another day, another weight, another ache, and somewhere beneath her ribs the child kicked again. The 3rd week of frost came without warning. It was not yet winter, but the earth had hardened. The barley sacks had been dragged into storage early, and the hens began to lay fewer eggs. The only greens left in the village were wilted mustard, leaves and frostbitten leeks, thin and sharp on the tongue. Fires were tended longer. Wool was layered thicker. Breath hung low and white in every doorway. For those who were heavy with child, the cold was no longer just a discomfort. It was a hazard. In the stone-floored cottage near the smithy, a young woman named Alice tried to stretch her swollen feet beneath a thin linen blanket. Her ankles had bloated so badly that her skin had split along the sides. Her husband, a cooper who shaped barrels for ale and salted meat, had found it amusing at first, called them her drum feet. But now even he was quiet. Alice could no longer bend to gather wood, could no longer reach the hearth pot without leaning on a stool. Her back ached in strange ways, stabbing, then numb. Her hips made a grinding noise when she stood. She could no longer feel hunger. Only nausea or emptiness. The village midwife had said the child was positioned deep and would arrive early, but the village had no early straw, no soft swaddles, no dried sage for bleeding, and the path to the manor nursemaid was frozen over with black ice. Alice spent most of the day alone. She watched the window for smoke from her neighbour's chimney, a signal that someone nearby might still have broth or cloth. But none came. Elsewhere in the pasture beyond the old chapel, a woman named Sabina gathered goat droppings with a wooden rake. Her belly, barely visible beneath her patched bodice, was beginning to swell for the fourth time. Her eyes were sunken from lack of sleep, and her mouth stained from chewing dried cloves to keep the sickness down. Sabina had buried her third child behind the barn in late spring. The second had died a month after birth. The first had survived, a girl now 5 years old, thin and fast, with long fingers and a solemn face. No one congratulated her this time, not even her husband. He had simply grunted when she told him. Another mouth, another risk, another winter of tension between hope and despair. Pregnancy in the village was not treated with ceremony. There were no calendars to mark trimesters, no gatherings of neighbors to exchange gifts, no feasts unless a birth coincided by luck with a saint's day. No books, no prayers specific to childbirth beyond the quiet utterance of Mary's name. There was only expectation, quiet and crushing. Women were expected to endure, to labor without complaint, to recover without rest, to continue as if birth was just another part of the season's work. A new child was not a celebration, it was a gamble, and in these cold months the odds were poor. By the second week of frost the bread had grown thin. Most homes were baking with more chaff and less flour. The smell of warm barley loaves still floated from chimneys in the morning. But it was faint, more memory than promise. For pregnant women, food had to be bartered, and there was little to trade. Alice traded a single copper pin for 3 eggs. Sabina gave her last jar of beeswax for a pouch of lentils. Another woman, Inga, sold her grandmother's wool shawl for dried plums, even though the plums had turned bitter from frost. Midwives advised soft food, gruels, mashed roots, bone broths. But there were no teethers, no salted crackers, no remedies to ease the turning stomach. Just cold clay bowls, sticky spoons, and stubborn bile that refused to settle. There was a word the villagers used: the waiting. It was not spoken loudly, but it passed between women in glances, in the way they rested hands on bellies, in the way they paused before rising, in the way they watched the floor instead of each other. It was the time between hope and blood, between the first flutter and the final scream. The waiting was heavy, unspoken, endless. Inga's story was known to most. She had been 16 when she first bled in the straw. Alone. Too early. Too much. The village priest had said it was God's punishment for secret fornication, even though no man had claimed her. The villagers had believed him. Years passed. She had married a woodsman after that. Quiet, strong, missing 3 fingers. He did not ask about the first child. Now at 23 she was expecting again. No one offered her prayers. But someone left a sprig of rosemary on her doorstep, the old sign for safe passage. No one admitted to it. But Inga wept when she found it, then tucked it into her sleeve. The cold deepened. Water in the wash basins turned to ice by morning. Pregnant women began wearing extra layers beneath their shifts, scarves tied not only around their necks but their waists to hold the weight. to hold the pain. Some nights old Tilda, the midwife, walked from house to house just to look, not to speak, not to treat, but to see which women were still, upright, which had gone quiet. She noted the glow in their cheeks, the stiffness in their gait. She listened to their silences more than their words. Tilda knew when the end was near, and not just of the pregnancy. One night, a scream cut through the village, short, ragged, then silence. The villagers stayed in bed. Screams were not new, and the cold made it dangerous to wander. By morning it was clear that Marta, whose bleeding had started 2 weeks ago, had lost both the child and her voice. She survived. Barely. But the fire in her eyes dimmed, and the next day she no longer answered when spoken to. The village priest gave a sermon that Sunday about sacrifice. He spoke of Job, of Eve, of obedience and trials. He did not speak of women by name. He did not mention birth, but the women understood. They always did. The snow came late that year. It arrived with no fanfare, just a dull grey sky one morning, and then flurries that thickened with each passing hour. The frost-hardened ground grew soft, then slick, then smothered. Within a day, all traces of the village paths disappeared beneath a quiet white hush, but for those heavy with child, the snow was no balm. It meant that every step outside risked a fall, that the roads to the healer's cottage were now impassable, that if labor began in the night, no one would reach the midwife in time, that firewood would need to be fetched by someone else, or not at all. Inside the poorest hut, one of the oldest women, Bertrada, sat on her stool near the hearth. Her hands trembled faintly in her lap, not from cold, but from memory. She had outlived 6 children. Only one had grown tall enough to kiss her cheek without standing on a stool. She rarely spoke now, but she watched everything. The young girls waddling past her door, the wool soaked in blood, the way pregnant backs bent over spinning wheels, as if every motion might be there, lust. Her voice, when it did come, always came soft. "They think it's over when it begins," she whispered to no one in particular, stirring a pot of thin root broth. But the body knows, the body remembers. It does not forget the tear, or the cry, or the cold floor. Elsewhere, the small church at the center of the village remained open day and night. A single candle burned at the altar, its wax melting crooked over an old brass dish. Women would sometimes pass through in the early dark, not to pray, but to rest. Just for a moment, they sat on the splintering benches, wrapped in cloaks too thin for winter. They closed their eyes and leaned their heads against the stone walls, letting the silence speak for them. No one knelt. No one dared speak. Allowed the thoughts that crawled behind their tired eyes. They all knew the risks. They all knew someone who had bled out before help arrived, or had lost the child on the second night, or had been sent home by the midwife with an empty stare and empty arms. It was not superstition. It was statistics. Lived, measured, endured. Inga's pains began 2 weeks early. They were not sharp but persistent, low, dragging cramps that made her lean forward as she stirred the pot. Her husband asked if she needed help. She shook her head. Help was not a luxury here, it was a cost, and most women had learned not to ask until they were certain they could not move on their own. That night, she felt the bleeding begin. It was not heavy, not yet, but enough to stain the straw beneath her. She did not cry out, she did not wake him. She simply lay very still, breathing in the scent of cold earth and dried meat, and whispered the names of her mother and grandmother, and every woman she had ever seen cradle a child. When the midwife finally arrived the next morning, called by the neighbor's son, she did not speak. She looked once at the bedding, then at Inga's hollow eyes, then at the faint steam rising from the hearth. She laid a hand on Inga's forehead, warm, too warm. The bleeding had slowed, but the body was weakening. Inga spoke only once that day. Let it be quick. One way or the other, and the midwife simply nodded. Not far from there, a younger woman named Lien was in her 7th month. She was strong, had always been strong. The daughter of a woodsman, the wife of a shepherd, she had lifted more than most men, scaled trees barefoot, carried stone from the creek for her home's foundation. But pregnancy had undone her. She could no longer carry her own bucket, could no longer grip her boots with swollen fingers, could not sleep for the fire in her hips, the heaviness in her breath, and worst of all, the shame. Because the women around her kept moving. Old Gilda still tended geese and salted fish. Sabina still gathered nettle in the snow. Even the girl from the next hamlet, barely 15, had fetched water with twins growing beneath her apron. But Lien could not move without shaking, could not eat without sickness, could not breathe without imagining. The child arriving too early, too small, and being too weak to even cry. Her husband tried to reassure her. He stroked her hair and fed her spoonfuls of broth. But there were no words strong enough to push back the tides of dread that crept in each night when the candle dimmed, and her belly turned hard as stone for minutes at a time. She knew that pain, knew it from stories, knew it from screams that had echoed down the village lane just a month before. The slow tightening, the distant cramp, the trickle of water on the floorboards, the silence that followed. By the middle of the month, 4 women in the village were nearing their time. 1 had a husband, 2 had midwives within reach, 1 had no one. She was a widow, barely 20, with eyes too old for her face. Her name was Mira. She lived beside the animal pens and had once been known for her singing, but her voice was quiet now, and her hands were cracked from washing her own bedding in melted snow. She had no candles left, no meat, no wool. She did not expect to survive the winter, let alone the birth. Still, she prepared. She braided her hair tightly. She swept her floor. She folded a strip of soft linen and placed it beside the cot. It was not for the child. It was for her mouth, to bite down when the pain came. The village, for all its closeness, rarely spoke of the birthing room. Men were not permitted inside. Children were kept away. Only women, the midwife, a sister, a friend, were allowed. What happened inside was sacred and terrifying, and if the birth went wrong, it was whispered over the next week in broken fragments. She tore too deep. There was no breath. The cord was wrapped. She screamed for her mother. She didn't scream at all. The birthing room was where time slowed, where prayers were whispered without form, where silence could mean life or death, where women passed through fire alone, then emerged either hollowed or reborn. When Bertrada was young, she had seen a woman bite through her own tongue during labor. It had been winter then, too. The fire had gone out. The baby had arrived in silence. Bertrada still remembered the blood on the woman's chin, the steam from the breathless child, the way the mother had held it anyway, like a victory, even as her life slipped quietly from beneath her skin. She never forgot that look. It was not grief. It was something older, something deeper, a kind of knowing that no matter how dark the night, the body had done what it could, and nothing more could be asked of it. As the days grew shorter and the snow deepened, the village waited for cries, waited for silence, waited for another candle to appear in the chapel window, a signal that one more woman had passed safely, or not at all. They waited with calloused hands, with trembling backs, with quiet hope. Because in a medieval village, pregnancy was not a chapter, it was a trial, and winter made the trial even longer. The village dogs had gone quiet, not because there was no danger, but because they too had learned how to conserve warmth and energy when winter dragged its teeth across the land. Their usual barks and yelps had been replaced by low grumbles and heavy breathing curled under carts, tucked near cook-fires, forgotten until the occasional kick sent them scurrying. It was this silence, this subtle withdrawal of sound from daily life, that warned the villagers more than any storm. Winter was tightening, and the pregnant women felt it first, not as a chill in the bones but as pressure in the lungs, heaviness in the legs, a kind of foreboding that came with each shortened breath. Marta, who had bled early but survived, now walked slower than she ever had. Her breath misted before her like a small ghost, each exhale more visible than her footsteps. The blood had stopped, yes, but so had her strength. She could no longer carry firewood, no longer fetch water. Her younger sister brought her boiled oats each morning, but Marta barely touched them. She spent her days beside the hearth, eyes open, hands resting on her belly, as if still confirming the child's presence. No one knew what she thought about during those long hours of waiting, but occasionally when she whispered in sleep, her lips formed a name, the same one over and over again, though the child had not yet come, and no name had been chosen aloud. The midwife Tilda began sleeping in shifts. Her old bones resisted it, but she knew that 3 births were coming within days of each other. She had dried herbs laid out in rows, sage, hyssop, comfrey. None guaranteed safety. All were meant to soothe, but it wasn't the herbs that kept her awake. It was the memory. The last time 3 labors had overlapped, one child had been born breech and died before sunrise. One woman had torn so badly she never walked properly. Again. And the third had survived only because her husband had run through the snow barefoot to fetch the midwife from 3 cottages away. Tilda kept her boots beside her bed now. She kept a jug of water warm near the fire. She muttered prayers into her woolen wrap, as if layering protection with each whisper. There were no miracles in this village, only preparation. Outside, the villagers had begun to count food more carefully. Single pigeon trapped in the loft was considered fortune. A rabbit snared in the eastern woods was shared between 2 households. Pickled beets, onion skins, dried peas so hard they cracked teeth. These were the tools of survival. For pregnant women, this meant less. Their portions weren't increased. If anything, they were often silently decreased, to preserve food for the already born. A mother-to-be like Lien would sip broth made from bones boiled 4 times. She chewed black bread so stiff it bruised her gums. She shared her bowl with her firstborn son, not because she was selfless, but because the boy cried more convincingly than her stomach did. The church bell tolled one evening just after dusk, not for death, not for prayer, but as a signal, a custom older than most villagers remembered, that one of the women had gone into labor. The sound rolled through the snow like a forgotten song. Low, muffled, one long tone, followed by 3 short ones. Gilda heard it from her cottage and sat up straight. She did not ask who. She simply stood, fastened her cloak, and made her way across the snow-packed ground. When she arrived at Sabina's door, It was already open. The heat of the hearth rolled out in waves. The air inside smelled of sweat and candle wax and pain. Sabina was on the floor, knees bent, hair soaked, her face ghost pale beneath a sheen of effort. Tilda was already there, kneeling behind her, whispering soft encouragements that did not promise anything. The labor had begun. Time slowed. The villagers walked past that home more gently than usual, speaking in hushed tones. Children were kept away. Men leaned close together to whisper updates, though none dared ask too loudly. Inside, Sabina groaned. The pain moved in waves, sharp, pulsing, then fading to nausea, then returning stronger. She had birthed before, but never like this. Tilda whispered that it might be a wide-shouldered boy, or it might be a twin hidden behind the other, or it might just be a long, slow labor, something even a strong back couldn't hasten. The room was warm with fire, but cold with fear. After 6 hours, the first scream came. Not Sabina's, but the baby's. Weak, but there. Tilda cleaned the child quickly and handed it to Gilda. The baby was girl, limp at first, but breathing, her limbs curling instinctively as the air kissed her new skin. But the bleeding began almost immediately. Sabina's breath came fast and shallow. She did not cry. She simply looked at the wall, wide-eyed, as the color drained from her lips. Tilda worked in silence, linen, pressure, a poultice of crushed nettle and moss. More linen. The fire stoked hotter, then prayers. The bleeding slowed, but it did not stop. Gilda wrapped the baby tighter. Outside, the bell tolled once more, a single soft note this time. Not for morning, not yet. Just a signal. A call to readiness, because if the bleeding didn't stop by morning, the child would need a wet nurse, and the child might not have a mother. The baby survived. Sabina did too. But her body would not be the same. Her legs would never hold her full weight again. Her hands shook when she tried to grip. Her stomach burned from within whenever she leaned forward. But she had lived. In this village, that counted as fortune. The other women watched from windows. Lien, nearly full term, listened for signs that the labor had ended safely. Marta, silent as ever, pressed a hand to her own belly and whispered the name she had chosen long ago. Inga lit a tallow candle and let it burn to the nub. Every woman marked the birth in her own way, not out of joy, but out of shared knowledge, because each birth reminded them of what could be lost, of what was likely to be lost, and of what would be expected of them when their own time came. When the thaw began, it did not bring relief. The snow melted slowly, revealing rot. The paths turned to mud so deep that carts sank to their axles, and even barefoot children stumbled. Water trickled through thatched roofs, mixing with smoke and dust and misery. Rats, fat from a season of hiding in haylofts and under ovens, came out to scavenge what the frost had preserved, and still the women carried on. Those still waiting to give birth now faced the second phase of hardship. Not cold, but damp. Not ice, but mold. Everything became soft in the wrong way. Straw beds sagged. Wool grew heavy with mildew. Walls wept with moisture, dripping over icons and herbs nailed there to ward off evil. Lien's labor came not with warning, but with a fall. She had slipped on the wet stone while stepping out to relieve herself behind the cottage. Her foot struck the corner of the trough, and she collapsed into the mud, her stomach wrenching hard against her spine. Her husband found her there minutes later, eyes wide, mouth open, body locked in a half-twist of agony. He carried her inside, laid her on the straw bed, called for Tilda. But Tilda was already with another woman, and so they waited. Inside the hut, time seemed to drip like the water from the beams, slow, constant, indifferent. Lien did not scream. She moaned, softly. Then louder, then not at all. Her husband pressed cloth to her head and tried to coax her to drink boiled nettle water, but she turned her face away. The pain had gone somewhere deep. It no longer flared. It hummed as if her entire body were a drum struck gently from within, again and again, a rhythm of something ancient and painful. When Tilda arrived, her face changed the moment she looked between Lien's legs. The blood was bright, too bright, and too early. It was what they feared most, a birth that came too soon, too fast, before the child could fight, before the body was ready. Tilda did not waste time. She gathered what she needed with practiced hands: linen, cord, a small, boiled knife, a salve of sheep's fat and comfrey. The birth was not long. Lien clenched her jaw. Her eyes went wide. She reached for something that wasn't there. And then, all at once, the child came. It was a boy, tiny, too light. His head no larger than a turnip. His limbs curled inwards, skin translucent, breath too faint to hear. He did not cry, but he moved. Barely. Tilda wrapped him quickly and placed him near the fire. She stuffed wool around the basket, creating a nest of warmth, then turned back to Lien. Her body had gone limp, still breathing, but distant. Tilda whispered to her, told her to stay, told her that the boy lived. But Lien did not answer. For 3 days the child survived. He nursed in weak gulps, slept often, twitched when the fire popped. Lien remained in bed, eyes open, silent. She did not hold him. She did not ask for his name. On the 4th night, the boy's chest stopped moving, and by morning he was still. No one rang the bell. No one lit a candle. The death of an infant who had never cried did not count the same as others. Tilda buried him in the thawed earth behind the cottage, beside a crooked fence post. She marked the spot with a flat stone, said no words. Lien wept only once. At dusk, alone, when the fire went out, and she saw the empty basket by the hearth. Spring brought mud, and with it came sickness. Not plague, not this time, but something smaller, subtler. Coughs that lingered too long, bellies that ached even when fed, teeth that cracked in the night, joints that swelled, eyes that wept for no reason. And pregnant women, already fragile from winter's grip, found themselves weaker than ever. Inga, who had held on through the bleeding, now found herself unable to keep food down. Even bread made her retch. She sipped broth. She nibbled pickled onions. She chewed dried leaves, but she grew thinner, and her child grew slower. Tilda visited often, laid hands on the belly, listened, watched. She said nothing aloud, but in her heart she feared that the womb had turned still. Elsewhere, Mira's labor began without pain. Her water broke in the night, a warm flood between her legs that soaked her only blanket. She waited for the pain to follow. It did not for hours. She lit her own fire, boiled water, laid out linen slowly, with hands that trembled not from fear, but hunger. The pain arrived in the early dark, soft at first, then sharp, and then the bleeding. She called out once. No one came. She called again. Still silence. She pulled herself to the doorway and opened it. Her voice broke as she screamed, not loud, but sharp, and by grace or chance, a shepherd's wife heard her. By the time help arrived, Mera had lost too much. The child lived, a girl, broad-eyed, loud from the first breath. But Mera did not. The midwife closed her eyes, and that night the bell did toll, once, then again. The villagers lit candles, not for celebration, but for memory. They remembered Mera's voice, her songs, the way she braided her hair even when she had no comb. They remembered her laugh, and the silence that followed it. In the days after, women in the village held their bellies tighter. They walked slower. They whispered more often to the saints. Some even tied charms of bone and thread above their beds, talismans not for luck, but for protection from what they could not name. Not every child born would be mourned, but every pregnancy now carried the scent of smoke, of memory, of cost. The village moved forward as it always had. Fields were tilled, seeds scattered, children ran again through thawed lanes, but the women remembered. They remembered the baskets left empty, the names unspoken, the bodies buried in silence, and, those still pregnant, walked through spring not with hope, but with quiet defiance. They did not smile, they did not glow, they simply endured. Because to be pregnant in a medieval village was not a blessing. It was a burden, a risk. A storm survived, only by inches and sometimes not at all. By the time midsummer arrived, the air in the village had turned thick, not warm, suffocating. The kind of heat that sank into skin and stayed there, no matter how many windows were opened or how many sleeves were rolled. Clothes clung to backs, hair stuck to foreheads, and flies began to multiply like whispers around a scandal. The livestock smelled stronger, the wells tasted of algae, even the holy water in the chapel basin grew a thin film of green. It was during this stifling season that the swelling came, not of bellies. Those had already grown taut and round with time. This was swelling of ankles, of hands, of faces, of joints. The kind that made it hard to bend, hard to sleep, hard to walk across the creaking planks of a one-room cottage without wincing. Isolde had once been known for her stride. Even as a child, she moved like someone who had no patience for slowness. Her feet were bare half the year, and even in her first pregnancy she had been seen hauling buckets of sheep's milk up the lane with no help. But not this time. By her 7th month, her feet were twice their normal size. Her legs throbbed. Her hands could barely close into fists. The pressure inside her chest made her dizzy when she stood too fast. She leaned on door frames now. She let her eldest braid her hair. She no longer fetched anything. And in a small way, that terrified her more than the pain ever had, because it meant she was not in control, not of her body, not of her child, not of what would come. She wasn't the only one. Swelling came like a plague of water trapped inside skin. Some blamed it on the salt pork, others on the heat, still others on the way the midwife had ground the last batch of comfrey. But all the pregnant women felt it, a pressure, a tightness, a sense that they were being filled too full, not just with child, but with something foreign. Something that didn't belong. One woman, Hilda, swore she could feel the bones in her face shifting. She said her nose had flattened, her wrists had grown wider, that her knees no longer bent the same. Her husband told her she was imagining things. But the mirror in the chapel, dull and spotted though it was, told a different story. There was a superstition whispered among the older women, that the more swollen a woman became, the more likely the child was to come in silence. Stillbirth. They didn't say the word aloud. They just touched the edge of their apron strings or muttered half-formed prayers into their cups. But the fear lingered, and every time a woman found her rings no longer fit her fingers or her shoes. Pressed against her ankles like tightrope knots, she thought of it. The silence, the limpness, the absence of the cry. The midwife Tilda tried to stay grounded in practice. She brewed teas of dandelion and raspberry leaf. She instructed the swollen ones to lie with their feet above their hearts. She burned rosemary on the windowsill to clear the air, though no one truly believed it would change the outcome. She remembered a time when 2 women had gone into labor during a summer storm, and the lightning had struck a tree just outside the birthing house. Neither child had made it, and some said it was the gods punishing women who'd conceived in spring. Tilda did not believe in gods like that. But she did believe in the body's quiet betrayals. She had seen too many. Isolde's water broke early. No warning, no pains. Just a sudden flood while she was pouring grain for the chickens. She gasped, dropped the bucket and stood frozen, unsure if it was blood or something worse. But it was the water, clear, warm, soaking her hem. The midwife was fetched. The village. Bell didn't ring this time. No one knew if the child would wait long enough for it to be worth it. Her labor was long, not violent, not loud, just endless. Hours passed, then a full day. Tilda stayed by her side, offering willow bark and honey, wiping sweat from her brow with wool strips soaked in lavender water. The pain did not crest. It drifted, like waves that never broke. Isolde cried only once. Not from the pain, but from the waiting. She whispered, "It's not coming," over and over like a mantra. "It's not coming." And then just past the second dawn it did. A boy. Breathing barely, Tilda cut the cord, wrapped him, handed him to Isolde with the calm of someone who had done it 100 times, because she had. But even she knew this time was different. The boy was alive, yes, but he did not cry. He blinked once, curled a hand, then slept, a deep, unnatural sleep. And in her bones Tilda knew he might not wake. Isolde nursed him, held him, sang to him. But the fear never left her, because every time he breathed, it sounded like the soft rustle of dry grass, and she could not shake the feeling that he was already drifting away. That same week, another woman went into labor, Greta's first child. No complications. The village had hopes for this one. Strong parents, strong bloodline, strong heart. But the child was born breech, and Greta tore so badly that Tilda had to stitch her in the dark. With thread boiled in vinegar and prayers muttered through gritted teeth. The child lived. But Greta did not stand again for nearly 6 months, and she never stopped bleeding. Not entirely. By summer's end, 5 babies had been born. 3 survived. 2 did not. 1 mother was lost, and every other woman in the village walked more slowly, stood more cautiously, and did not speak of the next one due, because there would always be a next one. And in a medieval village, that was both a certainty and a threat. The harvest came. With it the air grew cooler, the swelling went down, but the memories remained. Isolde's boy learned to cry weeks later in sudden fits. Greta's son grew fat, but she watched him like a hawk terrified of every cough. The others watched from their doorways, and the bell remained quiet for now. The fields had turned golden now. Stalks of barley swayed in long, slow arcs as the wind passed through, brushing them like fingers over a harp. The village, for a brief moment, pretended to smile. Baskets were carried on hips again. Bread began to smell less of mold and more of wheat. Men returned from the far pastures with blisters and sweat-lined brows, but also with rabbits, roots, sometimes even game birds, gifts from a landscape that had finally softened. But beneath this season of harvest, another cycle crept forward. 1. Nerve-swelling bellies, groaning joints, tightened breath and waiting. Always waiting, because food did not erase risk. Sunshine did not reduce suffering, and the womb, even in the warmest of months, was still a place where life and death sat in secret council. Among the cottages closest to the well, a woman named Elsbeth was nearing her time. She had married late, by village standards, and had watched 3 sisters bear children before she had her first. She was not fragile, not like Marta, who always wore her fear like a shawl, but there was something measured about Elsbeth. She moved carefully, ate with slow purpose, listened more than she spoke. Her belly had grown large, round and high. Tilda said this meant the baby sat well and might come into the world with ease. But Elsbeth did not believe in ease, not here. Not now. She had seen the women after, the ones who bled, the ones who screamed, the ones who did not scream, and she had heard the stories, the kind no one said aloud, only whispered into soup pots and folded linen. The day before her labor began, a sudden storm rolled over the hills, clouds so dark they turned noon into dusk, winds that whipped the thatch and sent chickens scattering like dry leaves, and the thunder, deep, long, as if some great beast beneath the village were growling through the soil. Elsbeth, resting beside her hearth, felt the first cramp just as the rain hit the roof, a low ache deep in her spine. She did not cry out. She simply closed her eyes and whispered something to the shadows, something old, something her mother had once said while holding a wet cloth to her own swollen stomach. Let it pass through me. The labor was slow, painful, not unusual in shape or rhythm, but tiring in a way that aged her between breaths. Tilda arrived an hour after the rain began. By then, Elsbeth's hands had gone pale from gripping the edge of her straw pallet. The house smelled of smoke and iron and herbs too strong for comfort, but she did not complain, only breathed. Only waited. The pain came in long waves, no cries, no screams, only silence and breathing. The child came at dawn, not screaming, but strong. A boy, round and red and wet as a spring apple. Tilda cleaned him quickly, checked his limbs, bundled him in wool and handed him to the mother. Elsbeth held him close, said nothing, then slept harder than she had in months, and for once nothing went wrong. But in the next cottage, a different story unfolded. Ragnar had been alone for her last 4 months. Her husband had gone with a trading caravan and was due back before the snowfall, but word had come that the roads were dangerous. Bandits, flooded bridges, a broken wheel, perhaps worse. She spoke to no one about it, only tended her goats, kept her door locked at night, and counted the days on her wall with scratches made by a blunt knife. When the pains began, she was alone. She walked the room once, twice, then sat near the fire, waited, tried not to think about the blood on her leg. By the time help arrived, Tilda, again, breathless from her walk, it was already too late. The child had come halfway, shoulders wedged, umbilical cord tangled. Ragnar had passed out once, come back, passed out again. There was no scream, only gasps, whispers, a distant groan like wind through an empty shed. Tilda worked quickly, pulled, cut, breathed prayers. But when it was over, the child was cold. A girl, still, and Ragnar was breathing, barely. The healing after such a birth was not physical alone, it was soul-deep. Ragnar did not speak for days. She did not eat much, did not wash. She stared at the window as if it might someday deliver her husband back from the dirt tracks of the distant hills. Women brought her broth. Tilda sat with her, carding wool in silence. And the village, for a time, walked a little more quietly past her home, because grief has its own scent, and it lingered. Meanwhile, in the outer farmsteads, a young girl of barely 14 carried her first child, too young, too narrow in the hips, too fragile in the arms. Her name was Lynette. She had been taken as a second wife by a man twice her age, and though her mother had wept the night she left, there had been no stopping it. Now, with autumn nearing, and her body swollen in strange, new ways, she slept outside most nights, preferring the clean breath of wind to the stink of the goat hut. Her feet ached, her gums bled, her breasts hurt even when the breeze touched them. She didn't understand all of it. She just knew something was coming, and she was not ready. Her labor came with the first frost, a thin sheen of ice on the barrels. The morning air bit fingers before the sun touched the ground. She bent to lift a basket of cabbages, and the pain came, so sharp she thought she'd been stabbed. She fell, and no one noticed for hours. By the time she was found, she had already begun to bleed. Her husband sent for help, then went to the chapel and left her alone. And when the midwife came, all she could do was try to keep the girl breathing. The baby did not live, Lynette did. But her voice changed after that. It grew softer, slower. She stopped laughing, even at the things she used to laugh at. Geese chasing children, the village drunk falling into a ditch, the old cat trying to catch snowflakes. She just quieted. A girl made smaller by what had left her. And so the season turned. The harvest was brought in. The nights grew longer, and the village waited once again for winter, for silence, for stillness, for more labors, more names, more graves. In the center of it all, the women kept walking, kept boiling roots, binding herbs, rocking the living and mourning the lost. They carried their pregnancies not as blessings, but as burdens borne in secret. Their stories were not written, their names rarely remembered, but their pain shaped everything, every cradle, every lullaby, every thread of wool twisted with trembling fingers under candlelight. Winter returned without warning. One morning the puddles outside the chapel were soft with mud, and by evening they were glassy plates of ice. The wind slipped under doors, through rafters, between cracks in the floorboards, where warmth once lived. Firewood became currency again. Even the children, who once ran barefoot through the summer dust, began walking hunched and wrapped, shoulders lifted high like they could hold the cold back with their necks. For the pregnant women, it meant more than discomfort. It meant danger. Swelling limbs stiffened, bones ached from within. The warmth their bodies craved was in short supply. Blankets were shared. Beds were lined with straw. Stones were heated in the fire and wrapped in wool to press against feet and bellies. But nothing truly kept the chill away. It seeped in, and when it entered the womb, it lingered. Tilda, the midwife, now visited daily. Not just for the women close to labor, but for those whose faces had lost color. She checked their fingers for signs of blue, tapped their knees, watched for trembling, and she listened. Because the ones who stopped speaking, those were the ones to worry for, not the ones who cried, not the ones who screamed, the ones who stared at the floor, at the fire, at nothing. They were the ones who were slipping. In a hut near the village's edge lived a woman named Brinna. Brinna was in her 5th pregnancy. The first had been a daughter, stillborn, wrapped in linen and buried without a name. The second had survived 2 winters before a cough took him. The third died within hours. The fourth, her only living child, was now 6, and silent as a reed in the wind. Now she carried a fifth. Her belly was high, tight. The skin stretched so far it seemed to shine even in shadow. She did not speak much anymore. She moved slowly. She watched the fire like it owed her something. Her husband had gone to hunt weeks ago and had not returned. The night her labor began, snow had started to fall. Large flakes, silent and soft, covered the thatch rooftops and weighed down the wood piles. The moonlight made everything glow cold. Brinna stood beside her hearth, bowl in hand, when her knees buckled. She did not cry out. She sat there, for what may have been minutes or hours, until the first wave of pain doubled her. The child was coming, too. Soon. By the time Tilda arrived, she found Brinna pale, sweat beading across her upper lip, lips cracked and bleeding from the heat of the fire. She had not eaten in a day. Her pulse was shallow, her breath trembled like paper. But her eyes were clear, and she whispered as Tilda prepared the cloths, "This is the last one. Not a prayer, not a wish." A fact. Tilda said nothing, only nodded, because there was nothing left to say. The labor was brutal, sharp, fast, relentless. Brinna screamed once, only once, when the head crowned, and then the silence returned. The child came out blue, limp, but breathing. Tilda rubbed his chest, cleared his throat, and waited. Then at last a thin wail, high and reedy, cut through the night like thread pulled from silk. Brinna did not smile. She only closed her eyes and whispered again, "The last." The boy was small, but he lived. She named him Leif, after her father. She did not swaddle him in anything new, only in a strip of an old winter tunic, the edges burned from years near the hearth, and she fed him in silence, held him close, and stared not at his face but at the wall, because joy was a risk, and hope had betrayed her too many times. Elsewhere in the village, another woman, May, carried twins, uncommon. Feared by some, they said twin births often meant one must be sacrificed for the other to live. Tilda had seen it happen. Once both came out still, once the second never followed. Once the mother bled so badly the twins were handed to the grandmother before she took her last breath. May knew the stories. She braided charms into her hair, tied herbs to her bed frame, burned dried flowers before sleeping. But when the time came when her waters broke and the snow rose high outside her door, none of it mattered. The first child came easily. A girl. Strong lungs, dark hair, a full head of it. The second, delayed. Hours passed. May moaned, then sobbed, then fell into a trance-like quiet. Tilda worked her hands like the tools of a blacksmith, pressing, shifting, pulling. The child was breeched and silent. When he came, finally, he was not breathing. Tilda turned. Him over, slapped his back, cleared his throat. Nothing. Then a cough, a tiny one, followed by breath. He lived. Both lived. But May did not hold them until the third day. There were no feasts, no singing. No one dared joy aloud anymore. Joy was for people who lived in castles, who had 5 servants and physicians and midwives trained in Latin. Not for them. Here, joy was dangerous, because it reminded you of what could be lost. In the chapel, a candle burned for each birth, small, simple, flickering. Some were for the children, some for the women who had not woken. No names were carved. only marked in chalk on the stones behind the altar, because the village did not forget, even if the world did. Outside the snow deepened, wood grew scarce, salt even more so, and in the dim corners of every hut a belly swelled, and a woman watched. It move, not with love, not with fear, but with the deep unspoken knowledge that to carry life in a medieval village meant to walk the edge of death every single day. The dead of winter arrived like a breath held too long. Every night stretched further than the last, as if time itself were frozen alongside the rivers. Mornings brought no real dawn, only a slow graying of the sky, like someone forgot to finish. Painting the world, the frost reached inside the homes now. It bit at bare fingers, crept up into wooden beams, and turned chamber pots into little bowls of ice. Curtains stiffened at the edges. Water in the basin near the hearth sometimes formed a fragile crust overnight. The animals slept standing, huddled in tight circles, steam rising off their hides like ghosts. And in the wombs of women, life stirred, tiny, invisible, persistent against all odds. In the tiny cottage near the smithy lived a woman named Tamsin. She had married into the iron trade. Her husband worked through all seasons, his hands cracked with burns and soot, his face always rimmed with smoke. Tamsin was known for her silence, but also for her sturdiness. She never complained, never begged. Even when her stomach grew round and her fingers began to swell from cold and child, she still fetched water herself. She had once joked to Tilda that her child would come out with lungs full of coal dust and fists ready to hammer. But by the 9th month, she no longer joked. Her labor began in the middle of the night. The fire was low. The wind howled like an animal circling the village. She woke to a pain sharp enough to steal her breath. And then another, and another. No time to call for help. No one awake. Only her husband, bleary-eyed and frightened, trying to remember what Tilda had said last time they met. He boiled water, laid out linens, kept the fire alive, but he did not touch her. He did not know how. Tamsin labored on the floor beside the hearth, hands gripping the edge of a wooden stool, teeth clenched so tightly her jaw ached. By morning, the child had not yet come. By midday she was shaking. By evening her lips were blue. Tilda arrived just as the sun vanished. She found Tamsin half conscious, still upright, still fighting. The child's head was lodged too far forward. She would have to turn it. There were no tools, no assistance, only hands. Tilda whispered instructions no one could hear, and then she reached in. The child came just before the second midnight. Girl, bloody, silent, then screaming. The sound was shrill and wild, like something ancient and untamed had entered the house. Tamsin collapsed, slept for a full day without waking. When she rose, she named the girl Ember, not for fire, but for the slow, quiet thing that glows long after the flames are gone. Farther out, where the forest met the old Roman road, a different kind of labor unfolded. An old woman named Freya had taken in her daughter's child. The daughter had died 2 years prior, from what no one quite knew. Some said coughing, others said bleeding that wouldn't stop. Now the child, grown to womanhood too soon, was heavy with her own burden. 16, unmarried, no husband in sight, and already too large to walk without pain. Freya kept her indoors, not from shame, from fear of whispers, of stares, of old men asking cruel questions, of boys laughing at what they did not understand. The girl, Alice, barely spoke. She sat by the window most days, sewing and unsewing the same square of cloth, her face pale as flour, her thoughts tucked somewhere far behind her eyes. She had not asked for this child. She had not wanted it. But it came anyway. Her labor began slowly, a leak of water, a cramp in her back. Then stillness. Freya tended her as best she could. Tilda came on the second day. By then Elis was moaning like a wounded fawn, but the baby did not descend. The hours passed like fog, soft, heavy, without end. At one point, Elis began to speak, not in full words, but in half sounds, as if she were remembering something she had never said aloud. Freya wept silently beside her, wringing her hands, muttering prayers that hadn't been uttered in her house for a decade, and, finally, as the last candle melted into wax, the child arrived, a girl, tiny, quiet, breathing. Tilda handed her to Elis, who stared blankly for a long while before finally pulling the child to her chest. And something cracked, not loudly, not visibly, but it cracked, and Elis cried, not for the baby, not for herself, for her mother, for what was lost, for what never came back. Elsewhere the silence grew louder. A woman named Corinne had gone full term, and yet the child did not come. Days passed, no pain, no signs, only swelling, breathlessness, tightness. Tilda feared what the silence meant. The child may be dead, stillborn, but without signs they could not induce labor. There was no method, no potion strong enough to force birth without risking the mother. So they waited. Corinne sat beside, the fire each day rubbing her belly, listening for movement. Some days she felt a flutter, other days nothing. She whispered songs into the fabric stretched tight across her stomach, and when no sound came in reply, she sang louder, hoping someone or something would hear. On the seventh day, the pain came, sharp, sudden. It tore through her without warning. Tilda was fetched, and Corinne screamed, not like a mother in labor, like a woman dying. The child came quickly, too quickly. It was small, blue, and still. Tilda did what she could, but nothing changed. Corinne stared, did not blink, did not ask to hold her child. She simply laid back, covered her face with her hands and wept into her palms. The child was wrapped and buried before dawn. No bell, no feast, only a prayer carved into a bit of bark, carried. Never held. The snow deepened, wood stores dwindled, food thinned, and the pregnant women of the village kept walking, kept breathing, kept bleeding in silence. They passed one another in the path, with nods that meant, I know, I remember, I survived. And that was all they could give, because no one else was watching and no one else would remember. In the heart of the village, past the baker's stone kiln and the crooked wooden chapel with a moss-cloaked roof, was a one-room house barely held together by twine, plaster, and memory. Inside lived Agnes. She was not young, nor old. She was one. Of those women the village didn't quite count, neither too loud nor too meek, neither beautiful nor scorned. She existed like fog on a morning field, present, soft, and gone before you noticed. Agnes was pregnant with her seventh. Only 2 had lived. Her first had been a boy. Strong, they said. Lunged his first cry like a horn, gone in 2 weeks. The second, a girl, had lasted longer, nearly to her 3rd winter. Then came the fever. The 3rd and 4th, she didn't speak of them. One born too early, the other too late. The 5th had lived, a girl with coppery hair and long limbs. A joy for a time. She helped Agnes hang linen and gather kindling. They used to sing together, quietly, when no one was listening, until she stepped on a rusted nail in the mud, and limped for 2 weeks, then coughed. Then stopped moving. The 6th hadn't drawn breath. Now the 7th grew within her, moving sometimes, kicking hard enough to make her wake with a gasp, then still for days like it had forgotten it was alive. Agnes no longer prepared cradles, no longer embroidered names on cloth. She simply waited. When her waters broke, no one knew. She didn't tell them. She sat in the chair near the fire and let the pain move through her like a storm across the fields. Tilda only arrived when her daughter, the only living one, ran through the village barefoot, yelling that Mama was shaking. When they found Agnes, she was on her hands and knees, hair clinging to her face with sweat, her dress soaked through. She whispered, "Don't light the candles." She didn't want to see. The labor was long, not from duration, but from memory. Each contraction reminded her of what she'd already lost. Each push was a name unspoken. Each breath a promise she could not trust. Tilda helped her through, as always. Steady, soft-spoken, unyielding. By the time the child came, at twilight, in a room with no candles, Agnes did not cry. She did not even look. Tilda placed the infant in her arms anyway. It was a girl, alive, breathing, quiet, as if she, too, understood the weight of entering such a world. Agnes named her Isolde. The name had no special meaning, but it sounded like something that could outlive winter. On the edge of the forest, in a clearing scattered with pine cones and crow feathers, another woman labored beneath open sky. Her name was Morwen. She had been driven from the village in her 3rd month of pregnancy. The reason: a whispered accusation, a charm bracelet, a dried toad, a fox seen circling her door at dusk. Witch, they said. She'd spoken to plants. She'd smiled when others frowned, and so she was sent away with nothing. She built her own shelter. Stacked pine branches for a roof, used stones to line the floor. She caught rain in bowls. Hiked roots, berries, even beetles when desperate. Her belly grew under rags, and no one came. When the pains began, the snow had melted into slush. The forest floor was damp and cold, but her fire was small and steady. She lay down on a pile of moss and closed her eyes. She knew no one would come, and she didn't want them to. The child came in silence, no witnesses, no prayers, no hands but her own. She bit through the cord with her teeth, wrapped the infant in her own shawl. It was a boy. He opened his mouth as if to cry, but made no sound. Morwen smiled, and for the first time in months, she wept. Back in the village, another kind of pain unfolded. A woman named Linhilde had been widowed during her pregnancy. Her husband had fallen from a roof while thatching. His name was scratched into the chapel stone with a dull nail. She now lived with her mother-in-law, a sharp-eyed, bitter woman named Hetta, who believed mourning should be silent and chores unending. Even with a swollen belly and blistered feet, Linhilde carried wood, ground oats, scrubbed linens, and fetched water. She had no choice. Her labor began mid-task. She had just hauled a bucket from the well when her knees buckled and she dropped it. The wooden pail cracked. The water spilled. She stood frozen for a moment as the pain rolled through her, slow and cruel. Hetta, hearing the commotion, stepped outside and hissed, "If you're going to drop something, let it not be the child." Linhilde said nothing. She just began to walk home. The child came in the early hours, a boy, large, pink, healthy. But Linhilde was too torn to rise from the bed. The bleeding would not stop. Tilda worked fast, but her face said what her mouth would. Not. The boy was placed in a basket, and Linhilda was packed with rags, her legs wrapped in cloth, and her eyes closed to everything around her. She would live, barely, but she would never have another. The tearing was too much. Her womb would never carry again. For some, it might have been relief. But for Linhilda, it was a quiet grief. Not for what was, but for what would never be. And still the cycle continued. The fire cracked, the frost thickened, and the names of women were whispered into the dark. Not as saints, not as martyrs, but as survivors of something the world did not bother to record, because no one wrote about the pain of women in fields, in huts, on mossy floors and soot-stained pallets. No one carved their faces into stone. No one chanted their stories in court. Only the wind remembered. Only the earth bore witness, and only the children born of blood and breath and silence carried pieces of their suffering into the next season. The air in the village was changing again, slowly, subtly. The wind no longer bit as fiercely, and the nights, while still long, began to release their grip just a little earlier than before. Crows flew lower. Snowmelt formed lazy rivulets through. The roads turning the earth to mud and the fields to dark, heavy sponges. It was the beginning of thaw, and for the women still carrying children, it meant only one thing. Survival was no longer just about making it through winter. It was about what came after, because spring brought births and births brought risk. In a home near the old stone bridge, nestled between a crumbling wall and a narrow lane where children tossed pebbles, lived a woman named Edith. She was tall and quiet, her frame thin even with pregnancy, and her eyes a faded grey that made her look older than her years. Her husband was a wheelwright, often gone before dawn, returning with sawdust in his beard and stories he never told. Edith was nearing the end of her pregnancy, and her feet swelled so badly that her shoes no longer fit. She walked barefoot now, moving slowly through the cottage, sometimes holding onto the walls to steady herself. Her sister had died in childbirth the year before. The memory of it lived everywhere, in the expressions of passing villagers, in the flicker of candlelight, in the way Edith's hands trembled whenever she felt the baby shift within her. She rarely spoke anymore, except to the baby. She whispered things to it. Not prayers, not promises, just words. I'm still here, not long now. You have to stay. The night she went into labor, the moon was low, heavy, like a coin pressing down on the sky. Edith lit no candles. She did not call for Tilda. She simply lay down and waited. The first contraction came like a rip through her spine. It doubled her, made her grip the woven edge of the blanket and bite down on a frayed corner to silence the cry rising in her throat. But she made no sound, not even when the blood began, not even when her vision blurred. She did not call for anyone. By dawn, the baby still had not come. Tilda was sent for only when the baker's boy heard the husband shouting from the door, a rare sound, ragged and raw, full of panic. When Tilda arrived, Edith was barely conscious. The child was transverse, sideways, wedged. There was only one chance. Tilda worked fast, guiding the baby with hands that had done this before, but not often, and never without risk. The room filled with the smell of iron and wet straw. And finally, after what felt like a century, folded into a single morning, the child slipped free. A girl silent, then coughing, then wailing. Alive. Edith had lost too much blood. She faded in and out, her fingers curling weakly, her lips murmuring things no one could catch. Tilda pressed cloths to the bleeding, spoke to her gently, stroked her temple, begged her to stay. Edith looked at her child once, just once, then closed her eyes and slept. 3 days later she woke, alive, exhausted, but alive, and the child, unnamed still, was nestled against her chest, asleep, breathing, warm. A miracle, some said. But Edith didn't. Call it that, she only said she waited. I think she waited for me. In the same village, 2 houses down, a different story was unfolding. A young woman named Rena, no more than 15, had been married off that winter to a man twice her age. Her belly had grown faster than expected, and the midwives said it might be twins. But Rena, who had barely learned how to cook, let alone mother, did not know what to feel. Her hands shook when she touched her stomach. Her nights were sleepless. She would sit by the hearth with her knees drawn to her chest, watching the flames flicker, and wondering if she would survive what came next. The labor began in the afternoon. There were no screams, only a low groan that built, slowly, rhythmically, until the house itself seemed to vibrate with the weight of it. Tilda came, of course, she always came, and Rena was brave, braver than anyone expected. But the first child, a boy, was large, too large. His shoulders stuck. Tilda worked quickly, easing him free, turning his body just so, whispering as she did, "Come now, little bear, this world's waiting." He cried when he arrived, a strong, full sound, alive. But Rena was torn, and the second child was not moving. Tilda reached again, deeper this time, her brow slick with sweat, her arms aching. The second was breech and silent. It took nearly an hour to deliver her, a girl, pale, motionless. Tilda worked quickly, clearing her nose, rubbing her back, flicking her heels, and at last a small gasp, then breath, then quiet, rhythmic breathing. She would live, but barely. Rena, now with 2 children, could not stand. Her body had given everything. She bled for 2 days and wept for 3. Not out of sorrow, but out of something far more complicated, a sense of being stretched beyond recognition, of being cracked open by life itself, of being remade unwillingly into someone entirely new. Back near the chapel, another woman, Miara, labored with her 6th. Her 5th had died before birth, and this one had been quiet for days. When labor began, there was no blood, no water, just pain, sharp, consistent, relentless. Tilda arrived late. By then, Miara was moaning, breathless, half unconscious. The baby was dead. No movement, no heartbeat, still inside her. And yet the labor had to be done. There was no escaping it. She had to push, had to bleed, had to endure the agony of delivering death. When it was over, Tilda wrapped the child in a soft cloth. She gave no name, and Miara asked for none. She lay there in silence, her face turned toward the shuttered window, her eyes unblinking. She did not cry, not that day, not the next, not ever, as far as anyone knew, and so the village pressed forward. Spring arrived fully. Flowers blooming in the cracks of stone walls, bees returning to the blossoms, goats birthing their own small, clumsy young. Life in all its ordinary glory resumed. But beneath it, woven through the quiet days and peaceful nights, ran the stories of women whose blood had painted the floorboards, whose breath had gone shallow so that another could take its first. No tapestries were woven for them, no songs sung, no feasts held, only the whispered names passed from mother to daughter, and sometimes not even that. Sometimes the memory was only a small scratch on the back of a door frame, a lullaby half remembered, a face in the firelight that looked just briefly like someone long gone. There were no real midwives in the Western hamlet, only women who had seen enough birth to know how a body bends. They didn't wear aprons or carry herbs in velvet pouches. They didn't read stars or recite incantations. They simply knew when to sit, when to press, when to hold, and when to let go. One of them was Myra. She had delivered 16 children over the years, not hers, for her own womb had failed after a second miscarriage in her 20s, but for others, for neighbors, for girls who knocked on her door at midnight with blood on their legs and fear in their eyes. Her hands were strong, her back bent slightly from age. Her voice was low and reassuring, like the distant sound of rain against slate. When word reached her that another girl, the potter's niece, barely 17, had gone into labor in the village's farthest cottage, she packed her things, a folded cloth, a bone comb, a small knife, a leather strap, and one long wooden spoon to place between the teeth when the screams came too sharp. She did not rush. She never rushed. Babies came on their own time. The girl's name was Sela. She had arrived from another village in autumn, pregnant, unwed and silent. The potter, a man of few words and fewer opinions, had taken her in after his sister died and left her with nothing but a note and a swollen belly. No one knew who the father was. No one asked. That silence was its own kind of mercy. When Myra arrived, Sela was already in labor. She lay on a straw-stuffed mattress, hands gripping her knees, mouth open in a silent cry. There was blood. Too much. Myra moved fast, not with panic, but with precision. She knelt beside her, pressed gently on the girl's belly, listened, watched. Then she whispered, "It's early, but we must begin." Hours passed. Sela moaned, then screamed, then wept. At one point she asked Myra if she was going to die. Myra didn't answer. She only said, "Not yet." The child came in the blue hours of morning, a boy, thin, wet, eyes closed, alive. But Sela had torn. Myra worked quickly, binding her, pressing heated stones against the blood, whispering something low and rhythmic, a chant, maybe, or a prayer, or just something to keep time. The boy was placed beside his mother, still sticky, still unnamed, and Sela, white-lipped, half-conscious, reached out and touched his face. Then she exhaled, like the final flicker of a candle. She did not move. Again Myra sat with her until the sun rose. She cleaned the body, swaddled the child, and when the potter came in, confused and bleary-eyed, she handed him his great-nephew and said, "He's hungry. Nothing more. Not grief. Not blame. Just survival." In another cottage near the field where wild onions grew in spring, a woman named Laura was preparing for her 5th birth. She had survived 4 already. One breach, one during plague, one during famine, and one during the flood that had swept the village bridge away 3 years earlier. She didn't cry anymore, not during labor, not even during the sharpest contractions. She had learned to breathe deep, grip hard and pray with her jaw clenched. She had also learned not to expect the child to live. The last had died in her arms before he ever took milk. She buried him herself, beneath the elder tree where her mother had once braided her hair. Now, as her waters broke and her back screamed with pain, she crouched on her hands and knees and let her oldest daughter rub her spine with garlic oil. There were no midwives this time. Tilda was 2 villages away, and Myra was still tending Sela's boy, so Laura bore down alone, not quite alone. Her daughters watched from the corner, wide-eyed and wordless, but without help. Her screams were brief, her breath short. And then the baby came. A girl. So small, Laura feared her hand might crush her, but she was breathing, barely. She wrapped her in a boiled cloth, rocked her gently and whispered, "You may stay, if you want." Then she slept upright with the child against her breast, the fire dwindling to embers behind her. In the village churchyard, the vicar's wife, Margot, laboured with her third. Her first had died in infancy, her second lived, but was sickly, bones too soft, eyes too wide, heart too quiet. This third child had stirred hard and often, kicking until her ribs bruised, twisting until Margot could not walk without help. The priest insisted it was a blessing, a holy child. Margot was not so sure. She had bled twice already, during the pregnancy. Each time she'd been told to rest. Each time she'd been told it was God's will. Now as she writhed on linen too fine for childbirth and tried not to scream loud enough to be heard from the chapel, she began to wonder if any God was watching at all. The baby did not come easily. The labor stalled for hours. Her breath became ragged. She threw up from the pain, cried out for her dead mother, pulled her own hair in desperation. The priest prayed over her, but prayers did not ease the agony. Tilda finally arrived long after dusk and took control. She muttered, "No God's doing this, just the body." Then she delivered the child. Another girl, this one born with a twisted foot. The priest frowned. Margot wept. Tilda wiped the child clean and held her to Margot's chest and whispered, "She came through fire." The priest said nothing, and Margot began to sing. Not a hymn, not scripture. Just a song her mother used to hum while spinning wool. A quiet, tuneless thing that made the walls feel less empty. And the baby, tiny, misshapen, fierce, stopped, crying. The village kept no records of its births, no scrolls, no ledgers, only memory, only stories told by women while plucking chickens, while hanging wet cloth, while stirring broth over smoky fires. Stories passed with murmured names and folded. Letters with lullabies, with quiet looks and unspoken grief. Because every pregnancy in that village had been a gamble, every labor a crossing, and every child born, no matter how fragile, no matter how late, no matter how short their breath, had been pulled from the mouth of death by hands that were never thanked, only remembered, in silence and shadow. Beneath the shadow of a crumbling mill, where the river slowed into a thick bend and the reeds swayed like 1,000 whispering hands, there lived a woman named Isbet. Her house was barely a house, more like a lean-to with mud-stained walls, and a roof that dipped whenever the sky wept. Isbet was alone. Her husband had died the previous winter from a rotted tooth that festered and turned his face dark and swollen. She had 2 children already, one living, a quiet boy who never spoke above a whisper, and one buried beneath a crooked stone with no name. She was pregnant again, 6 months, maybe 7. She didn't know. There was no calendar, no midwife, tracking her time, just her body and the slow-growing weight inside. She worked through the pain, spinning wool for a widow in town, fetching water for the baker's wife in exchange for scraps, scrubbing the parson's floor with a rag and bucket. Even when her back screamed and her belly knotted with strain, there was no room for softness, no room for rest. She told herself she would lie down when the baby came. Not before. Never before. And then, one morning, the pain sharpened. Not the usual ache of work or fatigue. This was different. This was pulling, tightening, a slow vice around her hips. She was still carrying firewood when her legs gave out. She dropped to her knees in the snow-laced mud. Gasping, clutching her belly, the wood scattered like broken teeth across the yard. There was no one to see her fall, no one to lift her, no one to notice that she crawled, slowly, breathlessly, across the threshold of her home, trailing blood behind her like a brushstroke. She gave birth on the cold stone floor. Alone, the child came quickly. A girl, small, silent. She did not cry. Isbet panicked, slapped her gently, rubbed her feet, blew air against her lips, and at last, a soft gasp, a whimper. Not loud, but enough. Enough to know she was alive. Isbet held her to her chest and rocked, tears cutting through the dirt on her face. She did not name her. Not yet. She would wait until spring. If the child survived, she would give her a name. If not, she would bury her beside the other under the crooked stone and forget. Across the fields, in a cottage with ivy crawling up its walls, another woman labored beneath the watch of 3 generations. Her name was Rowan. She was only 19, but in her family line, that was late for a first child. Her mother sat on one side of the bed, chewing the inside of her cheek. Her grandmother, almost blind, hovered near the fire, mumbling old rhymes in Breton, and her great-grandmother, half sunk into a chair, stared at nothing, her hands folded like parchment in her lap. They were all born in this house. All had bled on this floor. All had lived through births that felt more like deaths. Now Rowan screamed as the child came. Long labor, 30 hours. The village bell tolled thrice before the child crowned. It was a boy, strong, heavy. Rowan bled, but not dangerously. Her mother caught the child. The grandmother washed him. The great-grandmother, blind, motionless, whispered, "He smells like firewood and milk." Rowan wept, because it was over, and because it had only just begun. Down by the blacksmith's forge, another woman's story burned quietly. Her name was Elka. She had once been the miller's daughter, clever, bright-eyed, always humming, but then came the wrong man. A soldier passing through, a promise made under the elm, a belly that swelled before a wedding could be arranged. The miller cast her out. She lived behind the forge now, in a loft above the coal bins, pregnant, alone, mocked. She went into labor during a thunderstorm. The forge hissed as rain hit hot iron. The blacksmith's wife, and a woman of sour words and swift hands, found Elka on the ground, biting down on her own arm to keep from screaming. She didn't offer comfort, only said, "It's coming," and walked away. Elka delivered on the forge floor, smoke in the air, firelight dancing across stone, a boy, tiny, limp. She thought he was gone, until faintly he stirred. She held him so tightly, her arms shook, wrapped him in a rag from the coal bin, whispered, "You'll be strong, you'll survive where I didn't." Not far from there, a different kind of pain unfolded. In the manor house, far above the village mud and smoke, the lady of the estate was also in labor. Her sheets were linen, her room smelled of lavender, but her pain was no different. Childbirth does not care for coin or status. She screamed the same as Elka, bled the same as Isbet, and when the child finally came, dead from a twisted cord, she wailed the same as any mother. No one spoke of it in the days after. The servants were told not to mention the child again. The nursemaid removed the cradle. The wet nurse was sent home. The lady of the manor did not rise from bed for weeks, and the walls, once white and adorned with tapestries, seemed somehow colder, quieter, as if they too had been touched by that same silence. All across the village, These stories threaded together like roots beneath soil, unseen, interwoven. One woman burying a child in the dark, another feeding one by candlelight, one naming a daughter after a lost sister, another refusing names altogether, each one surviving, something no one would ever record, each one stronger than the world allowed her to be. In the dense woods at the edge of the village, where the trees stood like sentinels and the moss grew thick along the trunks, lived a woman no one truly knew. She was called Fenna by the children, a name passed down, whispered, guessed. She had no family, no husband, no priest to check her soul. She had been there long before most of the current villagers were born. Her cottage was built with stone taken from ruins and timber that had half rotted, patched with clay and bundles of reed. Smoke rose from her chimney year-round, though no one knew what she burned. She spoke rarely, travelled never. But the women still came to her one by one when their bellies began to swell in fear. Not because she was a midwife, but because she was the last place to go when nothing else was left. Fenna had delivered children. Yes, but she had also ended pregnancies, not with poison, but with hands, not with violence, but with choice. There were some women who came to her not to begin life, but to stop it from arriving. A dangerous thing, a sin, said the church, a crime, said the men. But Fenna took no coin, asked no names. She simply listened, then acted. That spring, a girl no older than 14 came to her. Her name was Mella. She had been assaulted by a stable boy in the manor house. She never told anyone except Fenna. When she arrived, she was already 3 months gone. The child growing inside her twisted her insides with every step. She could no longer sleep, no longer eat. She begged Fenna for relief, and Fenna, after long silence, said only, "Are you sure?" The girl nodded. Once, then again. The old woman took her in, gave her herbs, water, let her rest, and then, when the time came, she sat with her, held her, and helped the pain pass. The child did not survive, and Mella lived. No one knew. No one ever would. Elsewhere, in the valley below, where the mist rolled over the thatched roofs each morning like a woolen shroud, a woman named Hilda was preparing for her 8th birth. She had lost 3 children in infancy, another to the fever. Her hands were cracked from years of washing linen in cold water. Her husband was a mason. Quiet. Good. But they no longer spoke. About the children, only about how much wood they had, how many onions were left, whether the goat would survive another winter. Hilda labored in the same bed where she had been born. Her oldest daughter, now 12, stood watch. There was no midwife. That night, just instinct, pain, breath. The birth took 3 hours. The child was breech, but small a girl alive. Pink and furious, howling from the moment air touched her lungs. Hilda wept, not because she was overwhelmed, but because she knew the odds. Half of the ones who came this way did not live through the first month. She kissed the child's forehead and whispered, "Don't make me bury you." In the morning she named her Thera, not from the saints, not from tradition, just a sound she liked, a name no one else in the village had. Something hers, something new. Outside the village wall, a woman named Leni stood beneath an old oak. She was not in labor, she was not yet pregnant, but she had come to pray. Her last child had died last year, weeks before birth. Now each month when her time came and passed without blood, she stood by the tree. She tied a strip of cloth to the branches. Prayer, a wish, a warning. She did not speak aloud, just stood, eyes closed, hands on her stomach, waiting. In the months that followed, Spring gave way to summer. The fields filled with wheat. The sheep were shorn. The village held its small festival. Pies, made from the first blackberries. Songs sung over ale barrels. Children running through the alleys barefoot. And the women who had survived birth watched all of it from doorways, their arms heavy with infants, their backs still sore, their minds still raw from pain that had left no visible wound. No one marked them with medals. No one told their stories in ballads, but they carried history in their bodies. Their scars were quiet, private, hidden beneath layers of wool and linen. Their griefs were silent companions. Their strength, immense, immovable, was never named, but it was there in every child's step, in every lullaby hummed by a cracked voice, in every breath taken after a night that nearly killed them. Because in that village, to be pregnant was to gamble with your life, to bleed and break and scream in the dark. And if you survived, you were not called a hero. You were expected to rise the next day, cook the porridge, fetch the water, smile at the priest. No one asked how it felt. No one let you sleep. No one said, thank you. But the world you rebuilt, baby by baby, breath by breath, kept turning because you had survived it, and no one else could have.